It's Monday, October 4th, 2021. This is LA Podcast episode 194. I'm Scott Frazier here with Rachel Reyes and Matt Tinoco. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
It is a pleasure to be here.
I'm riding like the sleep deprivation high where I have a lot of energy right now and it will not last. So you guys get the best I have to offer this
We get peak Scott.
I've always felt that I'm sharpest after one night of 5 hours of sleep. And then it's just all downhill from there if it repeats.
It's like the adrenaline high where your body's like, oh shit, this could be the end. gotta give it my all for about a 90-minute burst here, and then we just crash. We have never missed an episode of this show. That's something that we talk about a lot, and it feels particularly like an accomplishment in times like this where it's like we all have other things going on. I have a baby that keeps me up until 2 a.m. Shout out to my baby girl. Keep doing your thing. Keep me on my toes. Nonetheless, 194 consecutive weeks. We also want to thank all of our subscribers who have helped make that possible, because without the support of our Sepulveda pass holders, I think it's very unlikely that we would have that streak going. We also, in October, we get to celebrate that we just concluded our first ever member drive. New member September had to end at some point. It was a wonderful success. Thank you to everybody who signed up for the first time. There were so many of you who joined. I think we have something like 10% more subscribers now than we did just 30 days ago. That's incredible. We want to just give you the certainty of knowledge that what that money is going towards is helping us fund new programming, and also we're looking to bring more full-time staff on board to join Matt, our only full-time staff at the moment.
It's pretty difficult.
It's difficult. He's lonely. We need
to help Matt.
We want to help him out. We don't want him to go crazy.
I need someone who can copy edit. Period. I guess I could say more here. But there's a lot of needs here, which I guess may as well also add if you, good listener, are interested in contributing in some way. Also, you don't have to be a reporter too. If you're looking to help us in some way, shape, manner, or form, there's lots of. The process of actually assembling a more formal ask, where like a proverbial job descriptions here, which I have not done yet because, as you heard, it's just me, and there's lots of different things to get done. But this is also my ask to you if you're interested in contributing, whether that's like writing, or if you have an audio story, or if there's other ways you want to contribute, like copy editing, or I don't know, if you want to just get in touch with me, I'm sure I can figure something else out here. And like, we will also compensate you for your time. We have, because of Patreon, there is an amount of money, some amount of money that we can use to pay you for your work. And having been a freelance reporter in Los Angeles, I know how miserable it is to be a freelancer in Los Angeles reporting. And it is my intention to definitely not, to be a good contractor and pay timely and do all of that stuff that I know so many other places haven't. So Matt at thelapod.com is how you can get in touch with me. And please do that. There's no shortage of things. Or if you want to offer stuff or whatever, we can talk. That's my ask.
Hit Matt up offline. We can talk. We are so thrilled for everybody who joined. And shout out to Bryce, Alistair, Noah, Victor, Lindsay Page, John, Leva. These are just some of the folks who joined last month. You are greatly appreciated. Just a couple of dollars a month is all it takes for us to expand what we're doing as independent media. We also have the Discord server that we launched this week. It is fun. I am enjoying being in there, talking to people who love Los Angeles or hate it. I don't care. I'll take either, frankly. Anything but apathy is cool with me. And we also have our newsletter coming out weekly. Saturday, we had what in the newsletter?
You'll hear about it in my LA story. There's a lot of things, but I'm sorry, Matt's bringing up a lot of kind of downer things in this episode, but one of my unsheltered neighbors passed, so that's what the newsletter is So.
We also have merchandise coming out soon, and we actually Matt, Alyssa, and I took a look at some fanny packs, and we are getting ready for that rollout. All right, that's enough housekeeping.
Rachel's excited about.
I know. I love the
I'm
fist
just
pumping.
silently dancing.
I wish there was I wish there was a sound effect that we could have you just wang on over there. Everyone loves merch. It's just fun. Go capitalism. And that's enough housekeeping. Let's get into our LA stories this week. Rachel, do you want to go first?
I do, yeah. So last week, Governor Newsom signed and passed SB 62, the garment worker bill that we have talked about for a couple of episodes. This bill has been 2 decades in the making. The Garment Worker Center was founded 20 years ago, and their entire, one of the biggest things they wanted to do was pass this legislation that ended piece rate pay for garment workers who became essential workers, during the pandemic and have always really been essential, right? The clothes that we wear, the things that we see, the beautiful clothes we see when we go out shopping, all of that is made in a factory by people. And so this was a huge victory for our state, but also certainly in Los Angeles. So the Garment Workers Center hosted a really fun celebration on Wednesday of last week downtown. And it was just great to hear from coalition members. And it was also great to hear from garment workers themselves about how SB 62 will improve their lives, but will also save lives because it's giving people money so that they can pay rent, they can pay their bills, they can buy food, and they can be compensated and respected in the way that they deserve. And so in talking about this bill with my family, I learned that my grandmother was a seamstress on occasion, and this was something that I did not know. Of course, I grew up, my grandma did our costumes and things like that.
Valley royalty.
Yes, Valley royalty, exactly. So when my grandpa was on strike with UAW, my grandma would go and work as a seamstress. And when she wasn't there, she would work at a dry cleaners. So it was just really interesting to see that I also have a personal tie to this legislation that I wasn't aware of before. So congrats to all of the garment workers and the Garment Workers Center for your advocacy. 2 decades is a very long time.
It is, truly. And this is, as we talked about, probably more impactful in LA than it would be anywhere else in the country. LA is the center of the nation's garment industry. So big news for the local workers. Matt, do you want to go next?
Yeah, you heard a little second ago, but basically there was a gentleman who lived right outside of my building who I knew as Jay. Older homeless man. He was a white man in his 60s. I don't know. I never was reporting on him or anything, so I didn't get a ton of information. I was we just talked about politics mostly, right? But he passed away this past week, which is difficult because I think, obviously, I've been a reporter who covers homelessness in Los Angeles for not very long time, but several years. And I've known a number of people who have passed away. And each time it's just really difficult because, in the case of this gentleman, it's I felt like I knew it was coming. I remember talking to him about his health. It was not good. The coroner's reasoning for his passing was heart disease, as it is for so many people who pass away outside. That is one of the key leading causes of death. And then also just after the fact, somebody goes on Nextdoor and posts another possible OD at this intersection where he was. He died on a bus stop. And there's a couple of people. I mean, but because he talked to so many people. So now there's a little memorial out there. There's a lot of people in the area who knew him. I knew him as Jay. Other people knew him as JJ. And I think the thing I want to communicate is that there's as you're going around the city and you see somebody who's in really bad shape, realize that they're really close to death. And that's what's going to happen. So if you see somebody who's in bad shape and then at some point they aren't there anymore, like one of two things happened. They either passed away or they were hospitalized because their health is really bad.
Yeah.
And in general, as I think, like communicating that unsheltered homelessness is a immediate personal health crisis for everybody who's experiencing it is, I think, a much, like as much as there's so many people in the region who are trying to, I guess, effectively like profiteer off the messaging that people are dying outside and like it's inhumane and blah 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 blah. But like there's no actual real interest in trying to, like, I tried to get healthcare to this man. He needed medical attention.
Yeah.
And because it just wasn't going to happen. And so I'm left basically, like, a number of neighbors would bring him food, I would leave him water, and that was effectively like what we could do. But like he needed medical attention and then he wasn't able to get it. And he complained, like, I remember he was talking to me about, he's like, yeah, I have like some chest pain and like sometimes it's hard to breathe, which is like, okay, well, I know, I see what's going to happen here. Anyway, but like, it happened and it's just like, I don't know, it's just crappy. But like,
it's just
also,
like, it's so sad. Like when it comes to homeless individuals that you encounter, I mean, let alone for the experience that they're going through themselves, it's just like when you see what's happening and you expect the worst, generally speaking, that is what is, there's like an iron sort of certainty to these terrible outcomes happening.
Yeah. And I think just as like in terms of the numbers, like this happens everywhere in Los Angeles County several times a day. And like when you, as much as there's a narrative about there are people dying outside, I don't think it ever actually communicates like the individual's story, and it gets narrativized and it's and used to like sweep people and build shelters and do the whole thing. When really it's there's no like one reason for this whole thing. And then at the end of the day, because unsheltered homelessness is such an individual experience, like the individual cases that end up in the county's the corner office and wherever else, like they're all super different. And it's each individual tragedy is like its own thing that cannot be, it's not something that you can generalize about. The only generalization you can make is that for the most part, it was it was just individual bad health, whether that's something like heart disease or cancer. Like there's people who die of cancer outside, right? Because like, I think, so I guess my last point is that like access to healthcare is a under-discussed point in the discussion of unsheltered homelessness in Los Angeles. There's a lot of discussion of like, just like access to affordable housing, which, yeah, sure. But also above that is just people, you don't have access to healthcare and there's no water. You can't wash up. I remember he had a cut that he was worried about getting infected, and there's no water, there's no food, there's no bathrooms. So what do you think is going to happen as long as the situation continues going on as it is? And like building 70 beds in a bridge shelter and then outlawing sleeping nearby is doing absolutely nothing to try and actually like increase access to medical care and water for the vast majority of people who are outside or like in a vehicle, which is anything. So, I mean, I can obviously go on, but I'm not going to do that because Matt just doesn't want to be a downer for you on your Monday morning. But like also, I mean, I think it's not something that we can ignore, and it's not something that we need to, and it urgently needs to be. I guess just
But let this be a call to action for everybody. You know, when you see your unhoused neighbors, talk to them, because these are stories that, I mean, I would have never heard this story about him if, you know, you hadn't taken the time to forge a friendship. And as much as housing is healthcare, like healthcare is healthcare.
Yeah, right.
And these are preventable deaths based off of choices that our city makes every single day to not prioritize putting people in housing and giving people healthcare. And that's what makes me more angry, is that none of this has to be happening and people do not have to be dying the way that they are.
Yeah, I mean, even when you just think about like what Rachel's saying about like not ever no one would necessarily ever hear this story other than the people who are weaponizing it for their political narrative on Nextdoor or whatever. Like there is, I think, certainly a tendency to extrapolate from what I was saying a minute ago, when you're like, okay, there's like a certainty that the worst is happening, and there's so little that anyone can do to stop it in individual cases, that there's a tendency towards exasperation or defeatism. But on the contrary, like, you can look at your story, Matt, and this man's story, and say, like, the very least that we owe to these people and what we can do for each other is refuse to let people just disappear and die completely unremarked upon, except by people who do not see them as human. That is more than a lot of people are getting at this current moment. So it's, that is to say thank you for sharing that story. My own LA story, I think, is related, at least in a sense that it is about the impact that COVID is having on our city and the ongoing crises that we have seen for so many years around housing and homelessness are evolving. I think I've just been taking stock over the past week or two of what I had thought early on in the pandemic a lot about, and then kind of slipped off my radar, which is, what does post-COVID Los Angeles end up looking like? It's hard because, like, at a certain point, you're like, okay, why am I thinking about post-COVID when COVID is still here? And I think that as I've been revisiting this over the course of the past week, particularly with the redistricting and the upcoming elections, which we've talked about last week, we're going to talk about more during this week's episode, that it is becoming increasingly clear to me that even though we are still in the midst of the COVID pandemic, there is a growing, it's like a behind the curtain sort of battle going on, but it is moving toward the center stage more and more each day over who is going to control this city after the COVID pandemic. It's like, to use what is probably not a totally clean metaphor, it is like a war is ending and there is a battle going on over who is going to control the peace. And that is sort of, I think, what we're seeing, what I am looking at day by day, who is going to control the narratives of what the city is going to be in the 2020s once the resumption of business as usual, whatever the new normal, so-called, will be after COVID. And I think that increasingly it's looking very bleak. Like we stand at a point where it's clear that there are really reactionary forces in the city who would like nothing better than to do a retread of all of the failed policies of the 2010s, perhaps with less civic visibility into them and less ability for public, like actual genuine public discussion, maybe sort of
simulated public discussion.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly the right term for it. Just sort of like a token but easily ignored opposition, which is something that already exists many places around the world, right? So it's like there's no shortage of models for which you could say, yeah, we are a real democracy in LA. We have an opposition. We let them say their thing over here 300 feet away or whatever, and then we just do whatever we're going to do anyway. Or we let them speak for 30 minutes in a city council meeting, but we're on our phones or whatever, and then we just do whatever we're going to do anyway. And in the event that an actual opposition candidate gets elected, we just literally erase them from the map. The interesting thing to me is that there are definitely forces, and it's not like it's not like this is just the 15-member city council or the 5-member board of supervisors. There are definitely established forces, be they business interests, be they, in many cases, landlords and homeowners who are working to make this city something different than it has probably ever been. And I think it's really time to start thinking about what your vision is for the future of this city, whether it is one that actually has room in it for the poor working class people who have been the heart and soul of Los Angeles forever and then some, or if it just doesn't. And I mean, I'll say that for me, one of the actual things that teed off me thinking about this was sort of getting back into a routine of going for runs, running through Echo Park Lake, seeing it, and as a fenced-off public space, which now the city is going to attempt to replicate at MacArthur Park, in the middle of the immigrant gateway to the U.S., just in general, like the single neighborhood that represents that more than any other. And yeah, like, Echo Park Lake now 6 months on from the enormous police action that the city government led there to clear out all of the unhoused people, many of whom made unhoused by the pandemic itself and the ensuing recession, are turning that into an enormous front lawn for wealthy people, running sprinklers during the middle of the day so that you can't actually use the space even when it's not fenced, not when it's closed in. And it just seems to me like we are pursuing a strategy of turning the city into a garden for the wealthy. And that is, you could be generous and say that was an unintentional consequence in the 2010s, but it probably wasn't. And now we're seeing I think a honed, really sharply focused version of that. And it will only get worse because we're 5 or 6 years out from the Olympics. And that is part and parcel to that whole thing. Let us on that.
I think I just want to interrupt you. I get listener feedback. I read it that LA Podcast can be a bit of a downer sometimes, and people want to know how to get involved. And that's one of the things like we're actively working on to like use this platform to help better connect you, good listener, to places where you can get involved. I cannot circulate. I don't have anything to tell you right now, but also just.
Oh, well, I do have one for MacArthur Park. Sorry, go ahead.
But just the thing I wanted to add is that there's an organization in Chicago called City Bureau that effectively works to train people who haven't been reporters before with like these skills of journalism. And this is something that I'm also very interested in doing in Los Angeles. So maybe like you haven't been a reporter or whatever, but you know that there's public meetings that you want to pay attention to, and you want to and other people can't, but you know that you can, if you want to like watch public meetings and do things around Los Angeles and kind of, I will help coach you on how to be a reporter and how to do journalism, and then work with you to write something to report on whatever it is that you wanted to pay attention to and that you think other people should pay attention to. So this is a soft announce of something else that I'm cooking, but also as another way to contribute just in terms of like getting more information out there. Like I very much want to help people who haven't been reporters or journalists or whatever, like do that stuff and just help other people get informed, which is a different thing. But go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I just wanted to say too, again, we know that there's a planned enforcement action by which we'll probably looking at another militarized police presence in MacArthur Park to close down the southern part of MacArthur Park south of Wilshire Boulevard. And there are protest actions planned for that. In particular, on the 14th, there's going to be an event in support of the unhoused residents there. And you should check us out on Twitter. We'll post a link this morning for more information.
Rachel?
And can I just add one quick thing?
Please.
I know that it can sound very overwhelming and daunting that all of these terrible things are happening and the people that represent us are doing terrible things, but there is so much power in that in that feeling. And the one thing that I really want to communicate is just to organize with your community, your neighbors, join a community org, join Ground Game. If you want, a wide sweep of things you can do, join No Olympics if you're terrified of what the Olympics will do to this city, and join the tenants union if you are a tenant and if you're a renter. Those are 3 quick things that you can do, but just get involved and talk to your neighbors and talk to your community, because there are more of us than there are of them. And that is the whole point of organizing and building power.
And voting.
Yeah, we're going to get into it with redistricting later this episode, but I think that there is plenty of reason for optimism as well. Before we get there, though, let's talk about our headlines. We do want to do, so on the back of course, what were heavy LA stories, we do want to give additionally a warning to our listeners that we are going to be talking about police violence. And we want to just let people know that up front in case it is triggering, as it might be for some of our listeners. And we do have chapter markings for this episode, so you can skip ahead to the next segment if you so choose.
Which is police accountability.
Which is hopefully a little bit more of a silver lining here. What we want to talk about, though, is that there were a spate of shootings throughout the Southland this past week. That we see sort of every week, but we want to highlight some of these stories in particular. Let's start with one that happened in Long Beach City schools. Matt, what happened?
It wasn't in a Long Beach City school, but it was a Long Beach school city. City. Long Beach
resource officer,
Long Beach
right?
Unified School District School Resource Officer, which is the on-campus security for Long Beach Unified. And what happened was effectively some students were having, I don't even think they were students at the school, but there were some teenagers who were having like a little fight on the street. And then the Long Beach Unified School Resource Officer comes and like kind of breaks them up. But then one of them, Mona Rodriguez, who's the young woman who was taken off life support, she gets in a car and then the car starts driving off. But then the resource officer fires 2 shots at the car as it's driving away. There is video of this. You can find it. The Long Beach Post has this, and it's a very fast, rapid interaction. But the crux of it is that the resource officer is discharging his weapon 2 times at a car that is driving away from him. And then it hits the young woman, and she is hospitalized and is brain dead. And then it was taken off life support on Friday. That's
she was a student at the school, right?
I don't think she was a student at this school, but she was 18.
Okay.
And she has a child. So there's there is now another kid in Los Angeles who lost a mother because of police violence.
Yeah. And this is the kind of thing where it's like the police here have such a ridiculous, it's like a cowboy mentality where it's like, I'm just going to pull out my gun and start firing at a car that's driving away from me. It's the same as the car chases and all of this stuff. It's so completely irresponsible. It kills people. And this is a case where it killed a child and left another child without their parent. It's the kind of thing where the blame gets shifted around so much, and police and the entire judiciary structure turn back around on kids getting into a fight and are like, if you hadn't done that, then this chain of events wouldn't happen. It's unacceptable. Like that is not a clear A to B, that kids get into a fight and that forces an adult agent of the state to pull a gun, shoot at a moving vehicle, and kill an innocent bystander. This is not a caught in the crossfire situation. There is no crossfire.
Yeah.
There's fire from one person.
One person had a firearm in this situation.
And it is the person who is meant to be an officer of the peace. Like it's
of the school.
It's
not
despicable.
even of
Yes,
the
exactly.
area of the school itself.
I mean, this is we were, I think, we talked about this a lot with LAUSD, and we were very happy on the show when the LA Unified School District voted to slash the budget for their school police. Because school police are just like not a thing that should exist. And at the time, there was a lot of criticism about LAUSD being this radical institution, and how are we going to protect children and project safety on school campuses? And to which the counter is, look at this. This is a fucking nightmare.
Yeah.
Why did you have somebody stationed on school grounds with a gun in their hand and a hair trigger and just waiting for the opportunity to take an unrealistic approach to public safety here? This is not a good model that should be allowed to continue. It's ruining people's lives. The only question is whether or not their lives that are important to people who fund them. We also wanted to talk about another shooting in El Sereno.
Yeah, this was a 24-year-old man named Leo Chavez who was shot and killed by CHP officers after a traffic collision. There was a car crash of some sort on surface streets. I'm not totally sure why CHP was responding if it was on surface streets. But it was there was a car crash, and then the man gets out of his car, and then he's from, I hesitate to make any, I'm not obviously, I don't know any more than like the general public narrative here. It's kind of like in the little bit of video that there is of this incident, he's kind of, it's possible he's under the influence of something. Maybe it was a DUI crash. This is one of the public speculation things that I have not personally confirmed. But effectively what happens is the CHP officers first tased him. It didn't tase, but then it didn't work. He was still on foot. And then he started moving towards the officers with his hands over his head. Like there's an attorney for the family now who's saying he wasn't armed. He didn't need to be shot. And then as he's walking towards the officers with his hand over his head at a distance, you can see this on video also, the police officers open fire and he is killed. And this is just, it's another situation where at this point, the family is well represented and is arguing that, again, this didn't need to happen. He didn't have a weapon. There's no reason for you to be opening fire on somebody who doesn't hold any weapon whatsoever. And then, I don't know, I'm just going to go down the list here because I guess that's what I should do here. But there was a non-fatal police shooting in South Los Angeles. I believe it was the South LA Sheriff's deputy at a hotel. There's very little information has been released, but that's basically what I can say. But LA Sheriff's Department discharged their weapons at a hotel in South Central Los Angeles. And then there's across the Orange County line, there was another fatal shooting in the city of Santa Ana, but it was the Anaheim Police Department that was the agency that did this. There was a man who has been later identified as the cousin of a sitting city council member for the city of Santa Ana. Brandon Lopez was the man's name. The council member's name is Jonathan Ryan Hernandez. Hernandez says that his cousin was having a mental health crisis. And the way the city of Anaheim responded, again, in the city of Santa Ana, this happened in Santa Ana. They threw a SWAT team at this, and then when the like little flashbang grenade comes out, he exits the vehicle. They shoot him many, many times right there in front of his family, who is on the scene trying to persuade police to back off, including an elected official for the city of Santa Ana. And if you go to the voiceofoc.org website, there's a really excellent story about this. But they have this quote from Jonathan Ryan Hernandez, who is a council member, again, for the city of Santa Ana. It's just, they killed him in my district, in my city, in front of his family. My family member gets killed on the very block he grew up by a police department that isn't even from here. Then they left. They just dipped. Business as usual. This was a mental health crisis. He needed help. And these were just as much as we focus on the city of LA and like the sheriff's department, Southern California is huge. There's LA County is 10 million people. When you add in the other counties, there's like 16, 17, 18 million people here. And all of that is happening every single day in this metro area. And there's a lot more than just LAPD shootings. The situation is by the numbers, LAPD is not does not discharge their firearm more than, like, say, the city of San Bernardino, which has one of, or Southgate, I believe, is in when you look at the state numbers, like the number of shootings per, like, capita policed by I don't know, I can't remember exactly. There's other cities that have this happen more often than even, like, the city of LA, as much as it happens in LA, which is, I think, a good way to pivot to the next sort of situation, because so much of how policing in California works is determined by state law. It's not municipal law. It's state code. And Gavin Newsom signed a number of bills this past week.
Let's get to the next headline, which is about state law. And this has been remarked upon for some time that California as a state has some of the most protective laws in the country when it comes to police officers. They are protected from their own conduct. They're protected from repercussions. They are protected from general accountability. That is starting to change, although it has been an incredibly fraught process. We've gone through years now in which the state legislature has attempted to tamp down on the overprotection of police officers from the responsibility to the public that they should reasonably have. But now Gavin Newsom, in one of the most important actions of the current legislative cycle, has signed away some of those protections for police officers. The new laws that are going to go into effect next year make it so that it is now possible to actually decertify a police officer who is found to have committed gross misconduct. Previously, or I should say currently, what is the case is that a police officer who is fired, a very difficult thing to do, fire a police officer in the state of California, a police officer is fired for having done one of any number of things that are either negligent or out and out malignant, can just find another police job at another department. They do this. There's sort of a rotating revolving door, rather, for bad cops.
Or like a school police department.
Or a school police department, yes. And people just show up and say, yes, I was fired for hiding evidence, for example, and yet here I am, or fabricating evidence, and here I am being a police officer somewhere else. That will now be much more difficult, as police can lose their certification, can lose their ability to be a police officer for these sorts of substantiated wrongdoings. We also,
I would hesitate. I mean, just to clarify how the process works, though, there's still a significant procedural hurdle to achieve decertification. It requires the state law that Newsom signed creates a new a state level board, a 9-member Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. So to achieve decertification, it requires a 6-person vote of this 9-person commission. And then that's when decertification occurs. But the officer is still allowed to now fight that in court. And I guess presumably invoking the Police Officers Bill of Rights, which is one of these state level codes that I think makes it very, very difficult to achieve justice for something like if an officer commits rape or something like that, which is one of the few reasons that somebody can get fired, but up until now, still not decertified.
Yeah, I mean, well, let me run down the remaining changes real quick, and then I want to talk about the potential impact on them. So the other two that we wanted to talk about, one signed by Newsom, is a change in the age of employment, which raises it from 18 to 21. So you can no longer be fresh into adulthood and be hired as a police officer or certified as a police officer. The second one is an actual requirement for cops to intervene when other police officers are using excessive force and prohibits retaliation against officers who report excessive force. These are sort of protections that are intended to change change to a duty to act, basically, where the law typically puts the onus on an individual who is perpetrating excessive force against a member of the public not to have done that. But as we saw to use a national example that's very familiar by now, the case of the murder of George Floyd, where there were multiple police officers who stood around and watched George Floyd be murdered. So we have these three changes: the age of employment, the decertification, which is a huge one, authored locally, I believe, right, by Isaac Bryan, and then the requirement for cops to intervene in situations where excessive force is being used. What do you guys think the overall impact of this is going to be? What is the upshot here? And to start with, like, is it enough in terms of what the legislature can do?
I mean, I think it's a really good start. My personal opinion is abolition, but until we get there, I do think that we need to have more things like this in place to mitigate the violence and harm that is done to our communities daily. So I'm happy to see it. I'm surprised, but I am very happy, and I hope that there's not, a whole slew of lawsuits from local police departments to try to stop it, or local measures to try and, tamper with this somehow. But I think it's a good first start. But again, for me, not enough.
The only thing I would add is that the decertification bill failed last year.
Right.
And this was the second attempt, and it was made weaker at the very last second. So in the original proposal, even this year, it was it went from a simple majority vote on the commission to decertify to a 2/3 majority. And then there was also a couple of provisions that stipulated that on the 9-person commission, there had to have been 2 who either have themselves been a victim of police brutality, excessive force, or who were related to somebody who had been shot and killed. And those were stripped out at the last second at the behest of the statewide police lobby. So, yeah, I think, like what Rachel said, it is a procedural start. But having watched plenty of police commission meetings where they say, oh, this was out of policy, whatever, and then okay, cool, that's it, and then nothing really changes, which is it's a start on the statewide codes. But I also think it's just we want to underscore, as much as there's like local organizing against the Los Angeles Police Department, so many of these rules are state level rules and require action at the state legislature to change. And that's where I don't necessarily, at least in my, circles, there's less explicit attention to what the state level codes are, but they matter a lot. And that's where I think there's probably going to be more attention into the future.
It's so interesting because people think about, and we spend a lot of time, especially when it comes to housing, where it's every city in California is local control. It's so important for me to be able to do whatever I want. And yet at the same time, the local advocacy of today, where in California and in Los Angeles, especially the advocacy thrust is on the left politically. There is a lot more powerful advocating happening on the left politically in Los Angeles today. But the local advocacy is running up against the tremendous barriers that have been hardwired into the state constitution in many cases, in state legislation and many others. That's true in housing as it is in policing. I mean, of course, we've talked a lot about Costa-Hawkins, which severely limited local control over things like rent control. That was passed in the 90s by real estate friendly interests. But in policing, much the same. We see that we have a very strong state Bill of Rights for peace officers. We have some of the strongest protections in the country for police officers that prevent accountability for police crimes, right? And And those things are all meant to circumvent the power of local constituents to effectively change the way that policing is done on the ground. And it was done a long time ago. This stuff far predates the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, because we've lived with this decades-long legacy of policing in Black and brown communities that just is openly paramilitary and occupationist sort of force. So I think there was a foreknowledge that police advocates had that there was a need to protect the agents of the state who were working in this openly violent way against a future shift in public feeling. But just to give a sense of how fraught this battle has been on the national level, even the conviction of Derek Chauvin, the killer of George Floyd, was not enough to pass the George Floyd police reform bill, which went down with really no reason given to the public. The Republicans were basically able to just say, "Oh, the Democrats want the moon and the stars," when pretty much anybody who has done a cursory review of that would say that it was a fairly moderately positioned bill for national standards around policing. More locally, Matt tipped off last year that we talked about the same decertification bill failing. It actually failed on procedural grounds because the state legislature, and in particular Los Angeles Democrats in the Assembly, Anthony Rendon, the Speaker of the House who represents parts of Southeast LA, decided that it was much more important for them to block a bill allowing duplexes and fourplexes than to allow a vote on police decertification. That was a calculus made by Democrats. And as a result, here we are a year later, having dealt with another full year of police committing crimes and potentially being rehired at other departments afterwards. So this is by no means been a straight line, and I can't help but think that we have much further still to go. But I don't see. I guess what I can say positively is I don't see the pressure going anywhere anytime soon, and I think that any politician who is expecting that pressure might be easing is making a wrong calculation.
I just wanted to add that so many of our laws are set up to protect white supremacy. So like even all of the things we just talked about that Newsom signed are operating under a system that protects racists and white supremacists. And that is the origins of policing. And the sooner that we can acknowledge that, the sooner that we can actually pass laws that will dismantle that. Because at the end of the day, like, you know, if a lot of the public lobbying that is happening is anti-police, all of the private lobbying that we don't get to see is very right-wing and is very pro-cop. Cops become lawmakers and they control from the inside as well as the outside. So, you know, this country and certainly this state and city have a legacy of protecting white supremacy. And I think that's something that we cannot leave out of this discussion when we talk about police, but also when we talk about the laws that are supposed to protect the community from cops.
Remember that LA was marketed as America's white spot during the early 20th century. But sorry, just digression. But
yeah, so let's turn to our last headline for this week, which is about the city's what would have been a vote on implementing a vaccine mandate in the city of Los Angeles. There was, as actually we've seen pretty frequently in the past couple of months, some procedural drama in the city council chambers as Joe Buscaino spiked an effort to make this effective immediately. This mandate for patrons of businesses and workers to get vaccinated in order to do a whole host of things. But now there will be a delay on that vote. Rachel, what happened there?
Yeah, so as you said, Scott, last Wednesday, City Council intended to vote on an ordinance that says beginning November 4th, certain covered locations will begin requiring proof of full vaccination with a COVID vaccine to enter recreational locations and events within the city. And so the point of this is to protect workers who are in high-risk situations to provide services to the general public. And, so some of these recreational locations include indoor restaurants, gyms, shopping centers, salons, and a whole lot of other establishments, as well as large outdoor events will require proof of vaccination or proof of a negative COVID-19 test. And this mandate will sunset upon the lifting of the declaration of emergency that was declared last March. So we knew that John Lee was going to vote no. So there was always going to be a second vote this week. But yeah, Buscaino, as you said, decided to withhold his vote and called the ordinance unenforceable and ridiculous. Regardless, they were going to have to vote on it again this week anyway. And it is expected to pass this week with a majority. And this also will not change the timeline. So this will go into effect November 4th after it is passed this week. So if you're not vaccinated, please go get vaccinated.
The good thing is that at least, as we record this, at least 77% of eligible Angelenos have received at least one dose, which is really good. The county is doing well at this point in time, but as we've seen in the past, good at this point in time does not mean good forever. Things do change and have done so multiple times during the pandemic. So, but the important thing I think to note about this with Buscaino is this. And I think maybe no coincidence that this is happening the same week that we get the formal announcement that Karen Bass, presumed to be both the sort of left baton carrier and also the assumed front runner in the mayoral race as a challenger to Joe Buscaino, that she is now all in her words, that Joe Buscaino is seeking to tack even further to the right and also to make headlines by standing up against what forces on the right perceive as you said, ridiculous or government overreach. This is sort of an interesting, it's like Buscaino is moving so far to the right within the Democratic Party that there's not much runway left before he just sort of skids out of it altogether, right? Calling a vaccine mandate unenforceable, and which, by the way, the Biden administration also did a vaccine mandate. And it's interesting, how is it unenforceable? How's it? If anything, it just brings the city into alignment with what is going to be increasingly the path forward from governments at all levels. So there is more. It's just more rifts within the city council. The city council, of course, has been taking its own giving its own recriminations to Joe Buscaino, putting out a motion making him step down from the council president pro tem spot. And they replaced him, of course, with Mitch O'Farrell, who's in no real way an improvement. So my editorialization there, sorry. But that is sort of just the state of city council matters. We want to get into our big story for the week, which is LA City Council redistricting. It's another of the mechanisms by which city council members operate to consolidate power in the city. Even though redistricting happens through a nominally independent commission, it is a thoroughly, as we're going to see, incredibly political process saturated with backroom conversations and these the deals that are made in order to empower politicians and their friends. Rachel, talk to me about redistricting. How are you feeling? As we are recording this is on for our listeners. We're recording this on Friday morning. The City Council, the LA City Redistricting Commission, has held a marathon meeting on Thursday evening which was characterized by a lot of confusion, not just for members of the public, but even for members of the commission itself. What is the latest?
It was a mess. No shade, but it felt very neighborhood council-y because it just went on.
I'm hearing this a lot, actually.
Until the edge of the night. It was just a lot of, I don't know what's going on. Can we do that? It was all just very odd.
It's like juvenile in a way
So
that would
juvenile.
be laughable if these people did not have so much
control
power.
the lives. You know, I mean, this
So
is
much
a lot
power.
of power and control. And I texted you last night at like 10:30, just because of all of just the mess going on with trying to redraw both Krikorian and Raman's districts.
Those are districts 2 and 4, respectively. Currently, Krikorian has North Hollywood and the eastern parts of the San Fernando Valley, getting close to Burbank. Nithya Raman, Council District 4, which covers the Hollywood Hills over to Los Feliz, Silver Lake, and Hancock Park.
And Van Nuys. It touches Van Nuys.
And Van Nuys.
I was trying to not get that involved or pay as much attention to redistricting because I don't know, I've seen the city get redrawn and pulled apart and cut up a fair amount of times, honestly, and I'm only 30. Like, I feel like I've watched it fluctuate so much that, to me, you know, history repeats itself. And so I was getting very worried when I was seeing all of these proposed maps for both of those districts. So I tried to unplug last night, but it was impossible to escape.
I felt the same way. I wanted to not pay attention so badly, and I couldn't manage it. Like it was like the neighborhood council meeting from hell. It was just it was everywhere. And that's saying a lot because they're all pretty bad. But Matt, what was your take on what first? Can you give us a summary of what the outcome of last night's meeting was, or Thursday's meeting?
There was the City of LA's redistricting, the City Council Redistricting Commission for the City of LA, because there's also an LAUSD Redistricting Commission that's stewarded by the City of LA. We're talking about the one that's about the City Council. They came out with a final recommendation of a map, but remember, it's not a final recommendation. So the redistricting commission submits a map to city council, in the K2.5. That was the one that you have to follow it. And even if you're following it, it kind of is obscure. But they recommended a map where it's for the most part, 13 of the 15 council districts are like recommended. And then they're not totally sure where they're going to put CD4 or CD2. Raman and Krikorian, as we noted. And they're not making a recommendation on either of those two council districts because, in the words of Chair Fred Ali, it would be a political decision to do so, which is, I don't know, dude. It's the whole thing. There's like having spent several hours watching this meeting, the entire thing is an arbitrary, politicized political process. And then what I also thought was in particular interesting is the differential in like procedural knowledge on the part of the commissioners, where you have some commissioners who are deeply familiar with the political process and know how to effectively make it confusing in a way that there's other redistricting commissioners who they were very open about, I do not know procedurally what I am voting on.
Yeah.
And this happened several times in several ways, and in my view was used to effectively kill other maps that would not have had we don't know where CD4 and CD2 are. And
the thing that's interesting about this, you're talking about map K2.5. It's important for listeners to know, especially if you haven't been following the process. Which, bless you, but I may you live long, long may your banner wave. The redistricting commission considered a raft of lettered map proposals, and there were different versions of them. So you have K1, 2, and 2.5, so-called, but you have also A through L, basically. And these were, as the redistricting commission said or attested, that they were shaped by the proposals that were sent in by members of the public, by the feedback from members of the public. This is always a fraught process. Redistricting is, in Los Angeles in particular, has been a legally contested matter every single decade. It is one that ends up with, and not for no reason, because we end up with neighborhoods being carved up, as Koreatown was last time, into 4 different districts. We have council members who see their influence grow, as we saw with Jose Huizar in the downtown Los Angeles area, because of their political connections and not for any real reasons apart from that, with consequences for the representation of the city and for the corruption of civic bodies, frankly. But this process is opaque. And so when we're talking about, map A, B, C through L, the redistricting commission's task, as it is laid out in the city charter, is to pick a map, pick a set of districts that are representative of the distribution of people throughout the city. One person, one vote is the Supreme Court standard. So the districts all have to be roughly equal in terms of population, regardless of whether or not those people are eligible to vote. And given the new census numbers, that means some degree of changing boundaries. The redistricting commission, though, being political appointees, each city council member appoints 1, the mayor appoints 2, and all of these people have differing degrees of political allegiance and affiliation.
And I think also knowledge is key, too. In what I watched, where there's some people who know how to invoke rules of like procedural rules and others who just don't. And
political ambitions, right?
Yeah.
Like some of the commissioners are speculated to want to actually run for city council, which is a tremendous conflict of influence, of interest. And when you see, as you presumably will in 2022 or 2024, don't worry, we'll remind you when a commissioner for the redistricting commission decides they want to throw their hat in the ring. We'll make sure to note that they perhaps were drawing the lines in a way that was favorable to them. But as I was saying, their task is to pick a map and recommend it to the city council. City council lines are approved by ordinance, which means that the city council writes the final version of this. And they don't have to take the recommendation of the redistricting commission, which makes all of this perhaps an exercise in futility, although the reference and the recommendation of the redistricting commission are likely to be taken heavily into consideration, because presumably the maps that are vetted by the commission are assumed to be able to pass the variety of legal tests, including the California Voting Rights Act and National Voting Rights Acts, and pass legal muster in the event that they are challenged in a suit. But this whole process is an entire clusterfuck. And we saw, I think, what at least I, but presumably other observers as well, I'd love to hear from both of you, was more brazen of a power grab happening in the redistricting commission than you probably would have assumed, particularly after the stumbles of the 2010 process, which was widely reviled and ridiculed as being just this mess of corruption where Virgosa, then the mayor, and Herb Wesson and Jose Huizar did pretty plain backroom deals in order to benefit themselves, and then were lambasted in the press by Jan Perry, who was the supervisor of the 9th district in South LA at the time.
Council member. It's fine.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. It was the council member of the 9th district in South LA at the time. Sorry, she just ran for supervisors. That's why those words are connected in my brain. But what we saw was not an effort to do better. We did not see an effort to do better. If anything, we saw an effort to do much, much worse. And in an era of ubiquitous social media, there's no way to hide these things as they're happening, the way that there might have been even 10 years ago. What is the most egregious part of all of this in your guys' view?
There was there was an alternate map. I think it was map L, which I I couldn't tell you how it. I mean, it's another alternative, right? That some people like. I think Scott might know more about, like, specifically that. But there was a map L that was just in terms of like where I see the process getting weaponized in progress. Where I think there was a former state senator, Richard Polanco, who I believe is Gil Cedillo's appointee, who he. As we're coming up to the point to like vote on the question of whether or not to consider L, he throws in another motion to table that motion, and it just confuses everybody. Effectively meaning that we're actually going to not actually, if you vote yes on this motion, then we're deciding no, not to vote on the other map. And so it never really even came to a vote because they decided not to vote. And it was during that process, there were several of the commissioners who are like they're professional, like they're professionals. They're not necessarily political professionals, but it is a class of people who are very well educated and like deeply rooted in. I mean, they got appointed by the council member. They're politically connected people who are like very knowledgeable about how this process works for the most part, but like. Also, they aren't very knowledgeable because in theory, they're supposed to be citizens and like regular people. And like, as this is happening, you have a power differential between like a former state senator who understands deeply, like, I guess, Robert's rules of orders and like commission and like how to, and due process, who's just throwing a wrench in it. And like, there were several people who were like, I don't know what I'm voting on. Can you please re-explain it to me? And then they re-explain it. And it's like, as I'm listening to it as like a person who can follow along a city council meeting pretty easily, I'm just like, I agree. I'm like, I think I know what's going on, but I'm really not sure. And I'm glad I'm not one of these people who's being asked to vote on something, because if I'm barely sure, I'm sure there's other people on here who are barely sure. And they articulated that, but it doesn't matter. And that was kind of one of that was the thing that stuck out to me, is that we're going to create procedural confusion to benefit my own desire to not have map L even considered. But that was one. I mean, there's so many choices, but that one sticks out to me in terms of a just particular, like, if I'm a sitting council member and I want to benefit myself, absolutely, I'm going to appoint somebody who I know knows how to create procedural mess.
Yeah, I fully agree with Matt. The L versus K debacle, and also Robert's rules, not for me. I don't care for them. I think they're really prohibitive, and I think that in a case like this where you do want input from normal people, right, who are not representing political interests, then Robert's rules is going to confuse people. Yeah. And I'm not going to get on a tangent for Robert's rules. I will stop myself there. But
this is the socialist proceduralism podcast now.
I can't stand Robert's rules. But I agree with you. I think it was the L versus K thing was really doing my head in, honestly. And, as someone who volunteered for Nithya Raman's campaign and eventually worked on her campaign for a bit, it felt very personal to me what they were trying to do to District 4, especially after a failed recall attempt. And it felt, it communicated to me, who is also a woman of color, that if you do big things and you change the city in a way that helps people and not political interests, that you will be punished in some way, in some form, by people you don't know and have never met. And that's what it felt like watching that. And whether or not that was the intention, I don't know these people's hearts, but it felt very personal to me. And it felt like a message to people who are running now to the left of incumbents, that at some point, if you win, you will be punished, and we will get rid of you somehow.
This feels to me, and I will preface, of course, my comments by saying that my wife works for Nithya Raman, city council member. So take whatever I say with a grain of salt. But what seems to me to be the case is that the most controversial aspects of the mapping have been the placement of Council District 4. They're not by no means the only controversial issues within the redistricting question. There is, of course, the fact that Watts has been stapled basically to Council District 15 almost de facto for forever and has been without real representation because they are kind of just stuck to the much more conservative politically harbor area, much more conservative, much wider, frankly, and very geographically far-flung. There have been comments made by Marquise Harris Dawson, council member for the 8th District, that during the last round of redistricting, all of the economic hotspots in his district were removed to other districts, thereby making I believe, the poorest district in the city and one without much acknowledged power among the political classes of the city. These are all things that have been playing out. However, a lot of the contestation of the maps has been about what to do about the northeastern area of Los Angeles in particular, because Council District 13, perceived by many to be the subject of some undercounted numbers in the Trump census, where, as I said, people should be counted regardless of whether or not they have the right to vote. However, the efforts of the Trump administration to depress turnout for people who are undocumented in this country appear to have been broadly successful. No more was that evident than in Council District 13, where there was an over 5% drop in the population from 2010 to 2020. Even with the gentrification happening in the district, that is a considerable outlier relative to the rest of the city. So what we end up with is a situation where in Northeast Los Angeles, the lines need to change in some way. But the way that the Redistricting Commission approached this in almost all of the iterations of the maps, A, B, C, et cetera, what they ended up doing was moving Council District 4 almost entirely out of recognition from its current shape, which is, as we've talked about before, a somewhat preposterous gerrymander. But the shape that it takes from Sherman Oaks to Hancock Park is no kind of geographically coherent shape. So the new forms that it could take have ranged from being a fully valley-oriented district to being one that encompasses all of Koreatown. That would be Map L, which we were talking about, which was tabled and not voted on last night. But nearly all of them share a characteristic, which is that the current council member does not live within their boundaries. Map L was one of the few in which Nithya Raman would actually be in the district that she is currently elected to, which we talked about previously is not a requirement of the redrawing. But Map K2 or 2.5 now,
2.5,
which was just a brief side note. Map K 2.5 is so called because there were two versions of Map K presented. K was one that the commissioners seized on and really liked. That's why they kept iterating on it. 2.5 was never shown to the public before it was voted to be approved as the privately drawn the recommended map last night. It was presented the same night that it was voted on and approved. And so that's why it's 2.5. There are not publicly available images of it. If you were,
they were put on during the meeting. By like 9 p.m. they were on the internet.
Okay, so they are up.
It was not at the onset of the meeting.
So the commissioners sort of did this backroom drawing presumably in league with the various politicians. They will no doubt deny that would happen. But the map that was voted on potentially sends Council District 4 all the way to the West Valley, making it a completely unrecognizable district. That is something that has happened in the past. Ruth Galanter, when she was termed out, her district was moved far from its existing location.
She was a West Side council, I believe, representing more or less what's Mike Bonin's district is now. And then her district was moved to, I believe it was what's Council President Martinez. It was either 6 or 7, one of the Valley ones.
So that is not unheard of, particularly for a termed out council member.
Which council member Krikorian, CD2 rep right now, is not eligible to run again.
Is termed out. However, would be unprecedented for a council member who is in their first term and by the time that this gets approved, in the first year of their first term. So what Rachel was saying about feeling like that the goal was to wipe out Nithya Raman's victory, in which she received more votes for city council than any other candidate ever for that body. It does sort of feel like that to me, again, with no small amount of bias, I'm sure. But the goal, as far as it appears to me, is to curtail a political victory that the recall proponents were not able to curtail. And also, I'll say, frankly, if that does happen and if it does stand, I have no problem being a little bit, more than a little bit, critical of the decisions made by the Raman office in light of that. I think that a lot of people have been of a mind that Councilmember Raman should have been more combative from day one, whereas the office has apparently taken a much more conciliatory tone and tried to build bridges with other council members when other observers, self included, have said there's not really a utility to trying to build bridges with people who view you as an existential threat. If this mapping does stand, that sort of, in my mind, bolsters that argument. It was basically a wasted year. If these people are so opposed to you being in office that they'll be like, and of course they would, pat you on the back in public and say, we're working together on this, and try to maintain the plausible deniability of, oh, I didn't do this. It was my political appointee who decided that you will not even be eligible to run for re-election because your district is now in West Hills. I don't think it's West Hills. West Hills would still be whatever the CD3 is, but it's like Canoga Park, Reseda, okay. Lake Balboa. Like the Sherman Way corridor. It's just like it's a tremendous fuck you, and it's a tremendous validation of the argument that there are not bridges to be built between the progressive wing and the conservative wing of the LA City Council. So that, I think, was my big takeaway. What we saw last night, just to clarify the order of events, was that the redistricting commission had the opportunity, or the suggestion was made to vote to recommend two separate maps to the city council. One of those being K2.5, which was favored by a number of city council members and their representatives. And then the other one was map L, the previously mentioned one that would preserve CD4 being in the basin at all. And so after the vote was taken to recommend K2.5, that was an up or down vote. They said, yes, we'll do that. Then there was tremendous opposition among the members of the commission to holding a similar up or down vote on map L, when it was perceived that it definitely had the votes to pass as a recommendation to council as well as a second recommendation, thus being having a stamp of approval, having that vetting against legal challenges that I was talking about a few minutes ago. Instead, it was met by Commissioner Polanco's competing motion to table any consideration for L. And so, yes, there was a great deal of confusion. The motion was tabled. Then you end up in a situation where people are like, are we still voting on L? Yeah. No. There was only one recommendation. It was K2.5. Conclude the meeting for the night. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're going home. See you in 2031. Well, that was basically the thrust of the meeting. And so what I want to just point out here, and in terms of the optimism that I alluded to earlier in this episode, the thing that I want to say about this is, people say about gerrymandering, it's when politicians choose their voters. You can choose your voters out of the electorate, but you can't always easily choose the electorate. I mean, as bad as this process is, it's not like we're in Texas or Florida where there is a systematic attempt going on to actually prevent people from being able to vote. As a matter of fact, California has been going the opposite way, and we're now going to have permanent vote by mail sent to everybody. Registration is easier than ever. The electorate in California has been reflecting that. And Council District 4, this is kind of where, to me, it's so interesting, because it is not like Council District 4 was drawn so favorably as to ensure the victory of a candidate like Nithya Raman. As a matter of fact, it was a nightmare for a candidate like Nithya Raman to come out of. It does have renter neighborhoods, but it is a very white, very wealthy district. So taking a nuclear approach, really like just taking the most extreme approach to drawing CD4 out of existence, to me, doesn't make a ton of sense. What you really have done is you have incensed a lot of people from across the city who worked hard on this one campaign, but you've done nothing about the underlying fact that if there are enough voters to vote a council member like Nithya Raman in what was the mess of CD4 before, they are out there. Like, however you draw these lines, that is just sort of where the electorate is right now.
And I think practically both of the potential CD4s are more working class districts than CD4 currently is, which is particularly the West Valley one. I mean, the West Valley is very working class north. I mean, the divider line, I believe, is Victory Boulevard, so it's like Victory North, which is working class San Fernando Valley. It's a majority. I don't know the numbers, but I would assume it's a majority renter area. It's not like South Valley homeownership, but that's a different discussion.
I mean, it's a completely fair point. And I think so. The point that I would like to make is, can the redistricting commission draw the lines in such a way that that Nithya Raman as candidate or council member might not personally win? Yeah, that's totally something they can do. It seems like an apocalyptic approach to one, frankly, like if you look at what has actually been done, like one fairly progressive council member, right? Like it's not the apocalyptic threat that I think that merits this kind of response. And the consequences subsequently, you end up with potentially many more districts that are going to experience the same thing. I think that what we've heard is that a lot of the efforts of this redistricting commission are engaged around keeping Mitch O'Farrell and Gil Cedillo viable in their own districts. Good luck is all I can really say. Like, I don't know how you draw a district, and Mitch O'Farrell really wanted more of Hollywood in his district. Hollywood doesn't like you that much. I know that there are rich people that like Mitch O'Farrell in Hollywood, but there's not you can't draw Hollywood in such a way that makes it more favorable in terms of the voters to Mitch O'Farrell. I just don't believe it can be done. So,
well, also at the end of the day, regardless, like you said, of how the maps are drawn, there are more renters, there are more workers, there are more people who care about this city and their neighbors than there are city council members. And I think that we really need to get out and vote. We really need to back candidates that have our values, because no matter what these districts look like, we have to still vote. We have to still participate in our communities and our neighborhoods. And yes, there are plenty of rich people and homeowners that like people like Mitch O'Farrell and Gil Cedillo. But as the years go on, and as city council fails to take action on housing and healthcare and education, more people are going to become unhoused, more people are going to fall into poverty, and the problems that we have are going to get worse. So at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter if we don't come together collectively and get these people out of office that are actively trying to harm you and harm this city. And so, hopefully all of the lessons that folks have learned from Raman's campaign and regardless of what this map looks like at the end of the day, we have to keep backing progressive candidates. We have to keep backing candidates that care about their communities, because that's the only way that we're going to move this city forward.
And just to kind of bookend that and go right back to what I think Scott was mentioning at the beginning, it's a map that's drawn to protect council members who, for the most part, operate in a way that protects their contributors, their constituents. I don't want to say we're all constituents. They're well-moneyed constituents who are like quite literally looking for a return on their financial investment in their district, and that is a big distinction from what the people of the city of LA actually need at this point, which is a local government that is actively listening to them and trying much harder than it actually does. I think the only other thing I want to say in this process is, or in this moment, is just a key thing that I think about a lot for local political representation in Los Angeles County, is that remember that in LA County, 1 in 10 people who live here don't have papers, who are undocumented people. And that's 10% of our county who are never, that's one of the things that I think, like in some other parts of, like the discussion on, as much as this commission is just talking about, we want to make sure the people's voices are heard, and like that political representation in LA is like we're trying to reach the people and make sure people are heard. If the city really wanted to, you could give the municipal franchise to people who live within the city of Los Angeles, but who are not going to be eligible to vote in federal elections.
Yes.
And that would be so much more impact. Like, I think, like just in terms of one of my own personal pet interests, like, should somebody ever give me $50 million to do a ballot proposition, that's what I would do for the state of California, right? Like, it's just utterly, I don't understand how you talk about talking to people and increasing political representation when fully 1/10 of our county cannot vote and is not, and there's no interest. I've so seldom seen any interest in letting people who live here, who are the underlying labor that makes this city work. Like, LA would not function without exploitable labor. There's no papers, no rules. This is how it works. And like, I don't know. It's just so infuriating that like I do not see any interest in doing that. And then what we get is, well, which district is the Staples Center going to be in? Oh, yeah, we can't partition downtown Los Angeles because God forbid we do that. But like, let's draw a line right through Lincoln Heights or Highland Park. Right. Places where, remember, it's going to be more than 1 in 10 people who live there who can't vote because they're undocumented. And like, but you know who is absolutely looking for a return on their financial investment? It's the commercial property owners in downtown Los Angeles who will have so many more resources to influence the process of redistricting than, say, somebody who's working 2 jobs as a valet, as like doesn't have papers, who's never meaningfully going to be heard by the political process. And that's, I think, that was on my mind as I was watching this meeting, and I was like, there's nobody here who is even remotely thinking about that 1 in 10. I don't know if for city, but for LA County, it's 1 in 10 residents is undocumented, and that means that there's no meaningful due process there. For the most part, there's the likelihood that, or they're not likelihood, but just like sorry, I'm just going to end here, but like, it's something that I think is incredibly salient here in Southern California. And that is not a public talking point. And I really, really think should be, particularly on the, I guess, progressive organizing end. Like, I think that would be a very galvanizing issue to bring the franchise to people who are undocumented, at least to vote in local elections. I believe San Francisco has done that, by the way.
Only for school districts.
Only for school districts.
And only for people who actually have children in the school district currently. This is definitely a hobby horse for me as well. It's and I've only heard it mentioned by one candidate for city council. That was Adriana Cabrera, running in Council District 9. I believe she is running again against Curran Price, and unsuccessfully last time, obviously. This recommendation for the lines drawn, that, as we said, will go to city council, who have the free hand to do whatever they want with it. If you want to advocate for them to select something different other than map K 2.5, you have the ability to do so. I mean, they can't stop you really, unless they put a 300-foot radius around their inboxes and voicemail, which I'm not sure they've figured out yet how to do. So that will be it for our show today.
Still can't go into City Hall, though.
Yes, and do remember, if you're ever on city property, you are not allowed to sing without the express permission of the nearest person holding a gun. This has been episode 194, and we will be back next week. Thank you to Matt Tinoco. Thank you to Brian Holmes. Thank you to my co-host Rachel Reyes and Matt Tinoco again. Thank you to our Sepulveda pass holders. We are so happy to have all of you supporting us and all of you listening. And we'll see you next week. Bye.